In April of 1907, the public was told the infirmary was working exactly as it should. There were rules, oversight, accountability. The people inside, the poor, the sick, the forgotten, were supposed to be cared for. On paper, it all made sense. A system designed to protect those who had nowhere else to go. But what was written and what was actually happening were not the same. Within weeks, that story would begin to fall apart. And the people inside that system would be the ones to pay for it. Within weeks, investigators would arrive. And what they would find would directly contradict nearly every assumption the public had just been given. Money that couldn't be accounted for. Records that didn't exist. Alcohol flowing freely. Patients who were not being controlled but indulged. And a superintendent who would be forced to explain it all under oath. The story of the Butler County Infirmary doesn't begin with scandal. It begins with trust, and then that trust collapses. In May of 1907, Butler County woke up to this headline. Over $12,000 of public money had been taken from the county infirmary. But when investigators stepped inside, they didn't just find missing money. They found a system that no one could fully explain. The man in charge was Superintendent Jones. He controlled the finances, the staff, and the inmates. And the infirmary wasn't just where he worked, it's where he lived. His family lived there too, which meant what was happening inside that building was happening under his roof. So investigators didn't just examine records. They examined daily life, starting with the superintendent's household. According to testimony, Mrs. Jones hosted company at least twice a week, sometimes a handful of guests, sometimes dozens. At one gathering, 52 people were entertained for dinner. Multiple hams were served inside a county institution, which raises a simple question. Who was paying for it? The next layer makes it worse. The county directors, the people responsible for oversight, weren't distant. They were regulars. Testimony shows they visited at least once a week, not for inspection, for food, for wine, for cigars, and during fishing season, they weren't monitoring operations at all. They were spending time with Jones at a fishing camp. The people responsible for accountability were part of the problem. Then investigators looked at purchases. One stood out, a large amount of alcohol charged to the infirmary. Jones didn't deny it. He explained it. He said it was used to treat 3 or 4 old fellows who had broken legs. He claimed a doctor prescribed it for bathing wounds. But the examiner pushed back. Alcohol and whiskey are not the same thing. Jones didn't retreat. He said he was not ashamed of the whiskey purchase. And then admitted something critical. The alcohol was made available to the directors and to inmates as medicine or as a drink. This wasn't tightly controlled supply. It was shared. Then came the most dangerous question. Morphine. Jones described the system. There was a medicine cabinet in the main building, accessible to the doctor. He denied that nurses were administering it. Instead, he said certain inmates were what he called morphine fiends. He named them Old Steve Finney, John D. Proctor, and he testified that Proctor would take 40 tablets a day if he could get them. The morphine was given in tablets, 1 or 2 at a time, supposedly under a doctor's instruction. But the doctor was only present 2 days per week. That leaves 5 days where control becomes unclear. No one fully explains what happens then. Investigators kept pressing. Who was responsible for administering medication? Who controlled access? Who monitored usage? And the answers didn't align. Responsibility shifted. Clarity disappeared. This wasn't one bad answer. It was a pattern. a system where control existed on paper but not in practice. Then investigators turned to labor. Able-bodied inmates were supposed to work. It was required, but Jones said he couldn't force anyone. The examiner corrected him. The law required labor based on ability, and any wages earned belonged to the county. But that system wasn't being enforced. Another rule in place that wasn't actually functioning. Then came more admissions. Jones acknowledged that he provided a plug of tobacco every week. To inmates, to staff. He called it tradition, something that existed before him and continued under him. The same pattern appears again. Alcohol, available, not tightly controlled, normalized. What should have been regulated was routine. Then investigators returned to the books. Multiple witnesses, infirmary staff, testified to discrepancies. When confronted, Jones gave one explanation. They were mistakes, ledger errors, nothing more. But those mistakes added up to over $12,000 missing. Then the investigation turned personal. Was Jones' family eating better than the inmates? Food paid for by the county? Jones denied it completely. But that question alone shows how far the investigation had gone. This wasn't one issue. It was a pattern, a system where the superintendent lived inside the institution. His household hosted regular gatherings. Directors visited for food, alcohol, and leisure. Alcohol was widely available. Morphine was administered with limited oversight. Work requirements were ignored. Records didn't match reality. And when questioned, many of these actions weren't denied. They were explained or dismissed, all under the authority of Superintendent Jones. What happened next wasn't justice. It was something far more complicated. Because as the investigation unfolded, the story didn't collapse into a single villain. It fractured. Newspapers turned on each other. Accusations became political weapons, and the truth became harder to see. One paper insisted the prosecutor was overreaching, that the entire scandal had been exaggerated for effect. Another fired back, arguing the investigation hadn't gone far enough, that something deeper was being buried. And in the middle of it all, the people inside the infirmary, the ones who suffered, began to disappear from the story entirely. But there was one outcome no one could ignore. The system itself was shaken, so much so that officials began openly discussing abolishing the very structure that allowed it all to happen. The infirmary leadership system dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up, not because justice had been served, but because the scandal had made it impossible to pretend anymore. And that may be the most unsettling part of this story. Because if reform only comes when the public can no longer look away, then how many others, like the men and women inside that infirmary, never made it into the headlines at all?